Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today, the Generational Cha-Cha, Choreographing Generational Motivators in the Boardroom and across the organization. Glad to have you with us today. Thank you for joining. All right, a few webinar reminders as we get started and a few points to mention. Our purpose today is to share trending and approaches to effectively integrate and leverage generational motivators to elevate both the board and the overall organization. Please write your questions in the Q&A section. Our goal is always to answer all questions at the close of the presentation. Yes, the materials, the entire webinar, as well as the presentation will be recorded. You'll get copies of this shortly for those that registered. And for those attending today with their IBDC.D certification, you will receive 1 CPE credit by attending. Please be sure to follow proper CPE credit submission guidelines. Thank you. Okay, I am your speaker and host today, Mark Pfister. I'm a governance and strategy expert. I am known for my book, Across the Board. I'm also known as the board architect, and I am the proud creator of the International Board Director Competency Designation, globally recognized board and board director education and certification in over 70 countries. Again, welcome to our webinar today. All right, so a few things to start with here as we talk about our goals for today's time together. And also what you want to walk away with from today's discussion. First off, as we're looking at this holistically from the generational trending and motivators, let's first talk about the named generations. Let's then move into generational motivators. What happens? What are these things in the background that cause these different motivators for each of the generations? What are some of the differentiators and fears of the different generations? How do these differentiators and fears actually manifest themselves? And what should our leadership approach be, whether it's in the boardroom or as someone who manages teams or leads teams at any level of an organization? I believe this is quite important. So we'll get through all of these topics today and move to questions following the leadership approach. Quick thing on the backdrop here, the correlation. Why are we calling this the cha-cha? Well, the main reason for this is that the name of the dance is an onomatopoeia. For those that are not aware of what that means, it's a type of word that sounds like or imitates what it describes. So in this case, similar to a structured dance, having a structure for your organization's generational considerations is equally important. We view this as the dance. And the choreography of this is, again, a series of planned situations likened to dance arrangements. We view this as similar to strategy. Just a little bit of a play here to have some fun on how we're titling this particular webinar. All right, let's talk first about the name generations. We've heard all of these before, but let's first start out with some of the statistics. So HR and business leaders today are facing more and more diversity in the workforce than ever before. And markedly, this is generational diversity. We hear about all different types of diversity, but know that one of the big ones that requires a little more focus has to do with generational diversity. The challenge with this is that with this growing trend comes the challenge of strategizing how to create a workplace where engagement, loyalty, and productivity are high, despite the differences among those demographic groups. So we all have heard these particular terms before for the 5 generations in today's global workforce. The traditionalists born between 1922 and 1945, the baby boomers between 1946 and 1964, Gen X born between 1965 and 1980, Gen Y, or sometimes called the millennials, 1981 to 1996, and of course Gen Z, 1997 to 2012. I'll add another new one on here. We call it Gen Alpha. That's anybody born currently after 2013. Now, in my book, we dig into this a little bit and we start to look at, are there sub-generations to these main generations? What years are those also? just by good measure, I'll do an overlay here of how sometimes we see a little bit of a discrepancy in the starting or ending dates of these particular generations. It's not that one is right or one is wrong. There are some areas of argument or differentiation between those. So you'll see here, for example, our traditionalists, or what we call the greatest generation in my book. It does vary by a few years. You also see that between the Gen Y millennials and Gen X, there is some discrepancy in the overlap of those areas too. But for the most part, just be aware that we're talking about typically a roughly 20-year or so span between the start and the end of what we consider to be a new generation. Now, further to these breakdowns of these name generations, there's a few studies out there. You'll also see some discrepancies in these studies. Let me point out a few of these. We can kind of get the gist or the trending of this. So, percent of workforce by generation, this appeared on UHC.com's website. We're looking currently at about 19% baby boomers in the workforce, 36% Generation X, 39% millennials, and 6% Generation Z. There's other studies out there that show these numbers somewhat different. So Statista is forecasting by next year the breakdown will be the following: 6% baby boomers, 35% Gen X, 35% Gen Y, and 24% Gen Z. So fairly close, a little bit different in some of the areas here that we see Gen Z, for example. But there's a big study that shows a pretty big difference here. And this is another prediction. This is Ernst& Young's report, Global Generations, a global study on work-life challenges across generations. They are predicting by 2025, millennials will comprise 3/4 of the global workforce. We can sort of extrapolate out from that what we view percentage-wise of the leadership levels, the C level, and the board level. But that's a pretty big percentage right here. And companies need to be very much aware of this, how they're attracting the proper workforce, how they're incentivizing their workforce. We're going to talk a little bit about those motivators in just a moment as we get into the different generations working together in the workplace now and in boardrooms around the world. So let's first dig a little further into the generational motivators. And we're going to start out with a quick fact here that generational experiences directly influence the motivators of everyone. So if we expand on the chart that I showed a moment ago, and now I add in here the notable occurrences, and this is again just scratching the surface. We'll dig into this a little bit further in a moment. But we know that for certain subgenerations of the main generations, there are specific instances or occurrences that have really formed the baseline or the foundation for the experiences of these particular generations. So for the greatest generation and then the subgeneration of the silent generation, we know that World War II, the civil rights movement, these were big instances of experiences that or occurrences that led to these motivators. If we jump to Generation X, we see Vietnam War, the Cold War, and of course, the rise of mass media and the end of the Cold War. Great example here in Generation X of spanning that earlier age and across into the digital age. And of course, Generation Y, we'll touch on this for a moment. I know you can read the rest of them here. A further rise of the information age, the war on terror, Iraq war, rising commodity prices. You're going to see throughout this presentation, especially as we start to dig a little bit further into these occurrences, that not most of them percentage-wise are not positive occurrences or major experiences that fall into the positive realm. It's kind of a shame, but it's human nature to let the more negative aspects in many cases guide our feelings and our experiences that we remember more deeply. There was a study that was done many years ago that said someone who has a positive experience tells at the most 3 other people, and those individuals that have negative experiences over a period of time wind up telling 15 to 17 people. So we can see this ability or focus more on the negative and the positive. I like to think that I, as well as everybody on this particular webinar, is more in the positive realm, something for us to focus on, something to develop. Please be more on the positive side. You'll live longer too. All right, so further breakdowns here. Let's look at these traditionalists or the greatest generation. And we're going to use a US example here. This came from a Pew Research study. And it looks at when the questions were proposed to the generation of traditionalists and the greatest generation, what did they come back with in this survey that was some of the big motivators of what formed their psyche? What did they view their generation as being responsible for or part of? And if we look at this, we can see certain things that are really more in modern times, I'll say, in more recent times, but also go back much further, of course, because of the age of this generation. So we do see September 11th here from 2001, of course. That was a huge motivator and understanding what's happening in the world and how they were thinking. But of course, it also spans back to World War One, JFK assassination, Vietnam War. All of these things here again are, for the most part, negative. Moon landing was positive, of course. The tech revolution, we could argue that's very positive. Civil rights movement, of course, positive. But we see a lot of mention in here of wars and strife and conflict. And you'll see this throughout many of the conversations we have today. And it's why we want to really focus as much as we can on the positive attributes of these motivators for the different generations, but truly understand some of the negative attributes and motivators that we need to be very much aware of in our leadership approach and style. So that was the traditionalists or the greatest generation in a US example. Let's then look at the baby boomers in the US example from the same Pew Research study. September 11th, of course, the terrorist attack is still up there very high. We see other things such as moon landings, tech revolutions. There are some similarities here, but we do see this a little more trending towards aspects that are obviously a little more recent in time as compared to the traditionalists. Gen X, we start to get a little more interesting, I believe, here. We again see some of these negatives here at the top. We see the same thing of September 11th. We see the tech revolution, of course, again, hurricanes here, shootings, those types of things. These are the things we need to be aware of in people's psyche. Do they feel safe at work? Are they in environments where they don't think that these are going to derail their thought processes or their creativity? Or is the leadership understanding that these fears are out there? We need to be very much aware of these things. You should start to see some of this trending as we go through here. So that's Gen X. Gen Y are the millennials. We see September 11th here again. We see different wars. We see the tech revolution. We see hurricanes. We see shootings. We see other things here. We're starting to move more into areas, I'll say even further, of unsettled society. Again, great point to make here is that we need to be very much aware that there is this unsettledness in today's workforce and leadership. How do we deal with that? We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Now, Gen Z and younger, the Pew Research data that I was using did not go past 2016. So we're obviously still gathering data for the current generations that are from Gen Z and younger. It'll be interesting to see some of the things. I believe we'll see some of the same areas that we just witnessed throughout some of the previous generations, but I'm sure there's a lot more that's going to be digital related here from where they're getting their news and how they're processing and reading news and these types of things. So we'll see how that actually plays out. It's likely a great topic for a follow-up webinar on this topic of Gen Z and younger and what their generational motivators are. Now let's talk about some of these differentiators and the fears. This is where we start to dig even further down into the aspects of what does this actually mean? How does this manifest itself? And we'll talk about the manifestation of this shortly. So first off, and let's try to break this down by different generations. I didn't go back to the traditionalist area, but we'll start with the baby boomers. 5 things to know about each generation, in this case, baby boomers, that tend to impact significant interaction among members of each generation. So in this case, for the baby boomers, continual learners, they are by far continual learners, many of whom want to keep working for the intellectual stimulation. So keep that in mind as we look at some of the other generations where you're going to see more of the monetary gain come into this, whereas baby boomers are very much driven by ongoing and continuous learning and this intellectual stimulation. They also resist any concept of them being viewed as old. You better watch your language. This is a given, I guess, for any generation, especially as we move into our latter years. We'll probably be quite sensitive to the word old as well. more tech savvy and into social media than they're given credit for. So one of the big things we hear about with baby boomers is that they're not tech savvy. In my experience, that is absolutely not true. Yes, there are some, but that's true of any generation. But the baby boomers were actually forced into learning and becoming more tech savvy to be able to be today's senior leadership. They love in-person contact. So this says like, I want to add the word love in this as it relates to baby boomers. It's how they were brought up. It was their interaction. They didn't have this interjection of the digital world to stop the face-to-face meetings. That's what they're comfortable with. I get it. I like the in-person contact as well. Just know this is a major focus of a baby boomer is having that in-person contact. And they're still eager to change the world, and they are quite optimistic. So if we were to drill down even further into the different generations, we would see that the baby boomers are, quite frankly, one of the most optimistic generations in times that we look at as compared to generations of today or closer to today's date. Good things to know if we look at this from a leadership lens. Let's do the same quick walkthrough of Gen X. So self-reliant and want their own piece of the action. So we're starting to see more of the individual recognition rather than the team recognition. This is very important for leadership to be aware of right now. Time is currency like money. We always say, even in our IBDC course, that everything has to be weighted against budget, scope, and time. So your personal life falls into the same category areas. But Gen X seems to be very focused on this time as currency, and is currency equal to money. Family and friends come before a boomer type work centric focus. So this is another given here that we see this with Gen X, even in a moment when we talk about some of the more recent generations, that this work centric focus is being pushed out, and the family and friends is actually moving into this. This is why you see many organizations talking about their work being a group of family members, or we operate our organization as family or friends. It's not by chance that you hear that type of wording when it relates to the workforce or to that organization's targets employees. Gen X did have somewhat of a slacker reputation, which evolved into more of a hardworking reputation. There's a breakdown I'll do shortly for you that shows different category areas of the type of work and which generations actually are viewed to excel the most in those particular areas. And Gen X doesn't trust large institutions. This is likely common across many of the more recent generations, where we see news that can be manipulated or opinions are considered to be fact. And this is why many of the more recent generations have lost trust in large institutions. A great point to make on this as it relates to trust. Trust is one of the most important components of any working environment, and especially a professional environment. And we want to make sure that employees trust, or leaders trust their company, trust the people they work with. There needs to be a major effort in these organizations to make sure that the trust is focused on and that it's built up. A couple of great books out there on this topic as well. Okay, Gen Y, or the millennials as they're called. Internet is their number one resource, of course, and they're willing to trade privacy for information and convenience. This is something very important to take into consideration, that as much as there is a fear of having your personal information out for everybody to see, Gen Y and the millennials are much more open to the ability to gain information by giving up some of their privacy, or in some cases, a lot of their privacy. They expect a lot of guidance and free information. This is something to be thinking about if you are in the sales or the marketing areas. If you're targeting Gen Y or millennials, how does your marketing plan or even your plan to attract employees to your organization, if you're looking for Gen Y or millennials, how are you leveraging this guidance and free information aspect? They are told they have a shorter attention span. They're uncomfortable with ambiguity. I know this is an arguable point. It depends on the person as well. But typically, this has to do with the environments they're in, where it's a short staccato of information that comes out. I know many Gen Y millennials that are much more interested in reading a 900-word article than reading through a book. I get it. We have to understand that that's our target market in many cases. Gen Y also demands full transparency, and pay attention to this one. Gen Y must see career opportunities or they become impatient and move on. The level of turnover in organizations right now by Gen Y millennials is absolutely massive. So, as a leader, we have to remember we have to paint this career. We typically call this, and I did an article on this some years ago called HIRE, or HIRE, HIAR. Hire, inspire, admire, and retire. That is the life cycle of someone's hiring. And we hope, of course, they make it to retire because that means that they spent most of their career, or the majority of their career in your organization. But we have to be very much aware that we need to paint this picture. You're going to see this trending even in some of the more recent generations. We want to stay laser focused on painting the pathway for a Gen Y or millennial on what they are to expect and where they're going within your organization. Show them what the path is very clearly. And Gen Z, if we talk about impact and interaction, hardworking problem solvers, concerned now with privacy and cybersecurity. In one generation, we flipped over, and that's almost 180 degrees. Value conscious. If we compare Gen Y to Gen Z, we see that Gen Y is a little more open with how they spend their money or their disposable income. If we look at Gen Z, we see a little more value consciousness as it relates to Gen Z. If you're in sales or marketing, you realize you're going to have a tougher time most likely selling to Gen Z than you would to Gen Y. Gen Z is typically very devoted to and personally involved in social causes. We see this over and over again. Organizations that are focused in certain social causes can actually help the landing of a Gen Z worker in their organization by not just talking about salary or the free lunches they're going to get by working in your organization, but show what social causes you're also aligned with and what it means to your organization. If you can make the links back to your mission, your vision, and your values, even better. And Gen Z also wants prompt and frequent feedback. This is a big change for most leaders. We see challenges with, say, a baby boomer leader with a Gen Z worker in an environment where you're looking at much different approach in how a baby boomer operates in a professional environment as compared to Gen Z. Are those generations able to actually come to common ground so Gen Z feels they're getting prompt and frequent feedback? And is, for example, someone in the baby boomer generation aware of the optics of making sure they are communicating properly and promptly and frequently to someone in the Gen Z generation in their environment? All right. And if we look here now at the fear influence, and I hate to always jump back to some of the negative components here, but there are fear motivators that we have to think about as it relates to the different generations. The reason I decided to include this in this presentation is that I want you either to evaluate yourself for your generation you fall into, but also look at other generations and try to make the correlation to why certain generations behave, act, decision, vote certain ways as well if it comes to decisions for an organization that they have to vote on the direction. So baby boomers' fears are, I know we're generalizing, stay with me on this, being displaced by younger managers and new ways of doing things, technology or other. Reduction in productivity is a big fear if they permit more flexibility. We look at the work at home as a great example right now. And new, as yet unproven to them, methods. Loss of professional identity, losing relevance, losing clients. These are fears that were also pulled out from different studies. This comes from a book, which I think is great, by the way. I recommend it. You'll see the reference here at the bottom of this page. You can Google it, The Compelling Case for Cross-Generational Conversations at Work by Phyllis Weiss Hasserow. Great book to read through. It gives a lot of details of how this actually falls in place and the leadership style between the different generations. Let's summarize a few other generations here. Gen X also has fears of losing clients, reduced profitability, losing millennial employees, meaning the turnover in support roles, not being adequately prepared for major leadership roles, lack of support from boomers and millennials. This could have something to do with the different leadership styles, and not having time for family or personal life. You probably see many correlations to, uh, I'll say, modern day complaints of workers about not having time again for their family or pushing very hard to work from home and getting rid of their commute so they can spend more time with their family. All of these things are linked. We need to understand the motivators behind these, and some of them, again, are the fear influence. Gen Y millennials, not understanding perspectives and expectations of older colleagues, not doing everything right, disapproval, not appearing smart, not having a voice or restriction of their self-expression. Again, more fears by generalized fears of this particular generation. We need to take this into perspective as it relates to leadership once again. And Gen Z, loss of privacy fears, cyber warfare, environmental harm. You can see this change we're talking about here, going back from things we mentioned just a few short topics ago for baby boomers. We're looking at big issues here and very different issues as compared to just a few generations ago. So, loss of privacy, cyber warfare, environmental harm, and climate change, global economic instability, and global terror safety concerns. We're starting to see more now of the terms of global and international thrown into this. It's not that, say, baby boomers don't have the international experience, but in the global markets and the international exchanges currently and global supply chain and global supply chains and global workforces, we do have more consideration now in the current generations for this global outlook, most likely on a bigger scale, as we could say, to previous generations. So these are some of the fears we have to take into consideration in our leadership styles and understanding of what motivates different generations. And let's talk about next how these manifest. So what do we see, or what are the outcomes of these things? So first off, let me say that if we wanted to summarize these primary challenges in engaging multi-generational workforces, it really has to do with a focus on how do we approach, say, the work-life balance topic or the career growth topic, loyalty, authority, corporate hierarchy. I know in my leadership realm right now, these are the 5 areas that I particularly focus on when I'm looking at how do I evaluate this organization or this board for that matter? How are they handling these things? Are they alienating one group because they're not showing the loyalty to an up and coming growth force within their organization by generation? How do they view authority? How do employees view authority in the organization? Is there a path for career growth, knowing that in today's generations, more recent generations, they're looking for an outlet of career growth and they want to know about it before they say yes and accept the position? So these are 5 areas to remember when you are trying to come up with strategies or goals in an organization. Start to overlay this on the top of it and say, am I catering to only one generation? Am I looking at this from only my generation in a myopic way? Or are there different angles? Are there different approaches to this? Or as I like to say, entry points in how we think about this? Go out and ask the questions. Get a group together. Put a little study together on this in your organization. Make sure your boards and your leadership teams are looking at these things with this overlay. And here's an actual example that I pulled from what I just showed you a moment ago in some of these manifestations. So this is the effect on work and focus. So in the particular study called The State of Leadership Development from Harvard Business Publishing, in this study, they found that 67% of baby boomers, 56 and older, described their organization's learning and development programs as excellent. With the only lacking area they mentioned was their own time constraints in that organization to actually apply this learning and development, these programs. But overall, again, baby boomers voted that their development programs in the organization available to them were excellent. Those same programs viewed by younger generations, we'll say X, Y, and Z. Only 40% of the younger leaders, 36 and younger, describe their organization's learning and development programs as excellent. So huge difference there. And what was interesting that I wanted to dig further into was why did they not feel that, or why was the number percentage less of viewing their learning and development programs excellent? And what we came to realize here in this study was that the reason for lacking was time constraints similar to the baby boomers, but there were a whole host of other areas here. Poor content, lack of relevance to their work, and a big one was lack of application of those opportunities or opportunities to employ those things they've learned. So it shouldn't be surprising right now that these actual survey results directly mimic what we just saw a moment ago in the concerns of the fears of the different generations. This is how it manifests in your organization. This is how organizations like Glassdoor, for example, when you see the ratings or people unloading about the organizations they work for, the companies they work for, it's not by chance that you're seeing more of direct and deliberate focus on areas, and you'll see more detail in those write-ups about what these employees are not happy about or these previous employees are not happy about in the organizations. We need to be aware of these things. We need the data for these. This is a picture that I took directly from my book, an excerpt from my book. The data itself comes from E&Y, from a study they did called Younger Generations Rise in the Ranks. And I've always found this. I still go back into my book and look at this, and I say to myself, this is quite impressive as we look at the different effect on work and focus based on the generations. So let's just talk about a few of these. And this is also done in a pretty detailed study. If we look at the ability to show executive presence, we should not be quite surprised, I would say, by what we just spoke about earlier, that the baby boomer generation typically is viewed as having a much deeper or more prevalent executive presence as compared to, say, Gen Y. Huge difference there. Some of these that are not so clear we may not know about is something like a revenue generator for an organization. Believe it or not, Gen X is one of the most profound revenue generators, and we can correlate this back to their professional and personal experiences, actually making them better at sales in some cases. Being more truthful, understanding that what's important to somebody that they're selling to, being more mindful of the generations that they are selling to or pitching to. Relationship builders, Gen X also comes out quite high in that as well as adaptability. Social media, this is where we start to see today that there are younger generations joining some pretty significant board roles or senior leadership roles, depending on the company and the industry, due to the fact that they have the expertise and the knowledge for things such as social media or reaching larger audiences. Brand ambassadors, you'll see Gen Y and Gen X very high in this as well. Um, Tech savvy should not be a surprise on the right-hand side here that Gen Y blows every other generation out of the water as it relates to being tech savvy. Cost effective. This is a funny one that we talk about within the IBDC program. And we say boomers are very much focused on the cost versus value to things that they're involved with. Again, we're not saying things are better or worse here. What we're saying is, how do you leverage these to have a robust work environment and have these areas represented and leverage the folks in your environment for what they're best at based on their experiences and their expertise and their generational motivators. So you'll see Gen X actually score quite high in many areas of this particular survey done by E&Y. And we believe that's because they span between two major points in time where they had to move from some of the baby boomer experience areas pre-digital to what we would consider to be the post-digital timeframe. So it really forced Generation X to span both of those areas and become experts and learn both of those particular approaches and knowledge base areas. Lots more to this. I know in this whole presentation, we're scratching the surface, but I'm driving this all towards the leadership approach. What does this actually mean? How are we applying this? What are we doing with this? So first off, we want to make sure that we begin with the end in mind and create multiple paths when possible. So how do we do that? Number one, in the approach, we need to exhibit that the organization has a much bigger purpose than just making a profit. The just making a profit to traditionalists and baby boomers may have been more than enough to get someone involved and expand once they're in the environment to other areas that they're drawn to. But in today's world, we need to show that it's not just about making a profit. It's not just about the salary or the payroll that someone's receiving, but it's also much bigger. And the outcome of this is that we're able to attract a wider cross-generational audience. We need to make sure that we're looking at the aspects of motivation for each of the generations now, again, just above and beyond the profit or the payroll side to the motivators. Another area, of the approach. Consistently communicate the organization's values, vision, and mission. Anybody that's already been through the IBDC program, this should not be a surprise to them. It's another testament to how you can leverage the values, vision, and mission of your organization to, number one, draw out the interconnectivityness of generations within your workforce. Play this up. Show that you are aware, you are conscious, and you're mindful of this interconnected aspect of your workforce across the generations, and also be able to listen for the types of questions by generation to evaluate their importance. So certain questions today that we may simply shrug off as not being relevant, if we lay that lens I showed you earlier, those five areas of hierarchy, as an example, we lay that overlay on this, we may say, well, this is something that's important by generation of a certain constituency of our organization. We need to pay attention to this. Let's at least evaluate the question. That's where the strategy comes in. And have agreed goals and strategies, but don't rule out personalization. So one of the big questions I get on this particular topic is, well, how do we ensure that we still have one direction of the organization? We have a set of agreed goals. We have a set of agreed strategies, But and again, without coming up with all these different approaches and trying to be all things to all people in the organization. There are ways to do this, and there are ways to personalize. So as an example, you can have in some cases, this can be done through different compensation packages. So we know that Gen X and Gen Y, as the example we show here, have larger college debt than those in previous generations. So there are ways to offset or divide up compensation, as an example, a very simple example, to a stipend or holistic compensation package to help offset some of the cost, which could actually attract some of these Gen X or Gen Y employees to your company. The next one is quite interesting, and I use it as an example just to show maybe some of the need for help in coping with today's stressful environment. So Gen Y is actually more open about having a therapist to help them manage stress or talk through some of their emotional challenges as compared to previous generations. So this could translate into wanting more therapy sessions, as an example, covered under their medical plan. So is there flexibility within medical plans that your organization offers? So there can be some personalization in that, depending on what that particular generational aspect is that they're looking for. So these can be great examples. They can be not great examples, depending on your environment. I know there's sometimes pushback on saying that, oh, well, Gen Y needs to toughen up. These things happen. They will come. Some of this has to do with experience. Just be aware that before we go to the negative evaluation of some of these areas, know that there are different motivators, different experiences, different expertise areas in these backgrounds. We need to be very much aware of this. We need to include this into our leadership style. We need to be asking the right questions. This is what makes us great leaders. We need to focus on these. All right, we're going to move to Q&A in just a moment here. I see a few questions coming in. Just a quick overview. Many of you today already have your IBDC designation. For those that don't, know that you can get your Modern Board Director Candidate Packaging and Modern Board Operations knowledge all in one shot, while also earning your globally recognized IBDC certification. Hope to see you in the program. All right, let's move to some Q&A right now. Let's see what we got rolling in here. All right, here's our first question. Why aren't more leaders talking about this is the question. Well, I don't know the answer to why they're not talking about it, but I am seeing an upward trend in this currently, and maybe that's due to all the discussions around it, and maybe even things such as this webinar. Many people are talking about this. If your organization is not talking about this, or it has not been a topic of conversation either in your boardroom or in your leadership realm, you want to make this a topic of conversation. Just the fact that you're considering some of these motivators, both positive and negative, you need to be aware of this. It will elevate your leadership. Let's see what else we have here. Can one or more generations be alienated by an unbalanced or significant focus on other generations' needs? Yes, absolutely. So this goes back to what we mentioned just a short time ago, that we need to make sure we're looking at this holistically. We don't want to be viewed as having plans and programs and approaches that are only applicable to one or two generations. We know that there are up to 4 or 5 generations today in most larger companies. Maybe that number is three or four, maybe five in some smaller companies today, depending on their size. We need to be very much cognizant and aware of this. So, okay, we see more younger bosses leading older employees in many companies. Is this causing issues? Well, in my experience, it's not causing issues. Typically, if a younger leader is appointed to a position, I would like to think they earn that position, which means they have the respect, which then means that age is of no significance in this. So I have worked for younger and older bosses throughout my career, and 99% of the time, I had the utmost respect for them because of their expertise and their experiences. I didn't view it as a generational thing. I didn't view it as a step back in my career because I was reporting into someone younger than me. That's my personal thought process on this. But again, if we're looking at the environment of an organization through the lens of the generations, it is something to be concerned with. Is everybody in your organization being led by someone who's younger? Are you looking at the different areas, say, of expertise uh, or experiences by generation that allow someone to be a better leader? We have to overlay these into our decision-making processes. I hope that answers the question. I hope for those joining today found value in this. There's a few references here. You'll be able to click on some of the links in here once the recording is sent out, and you'll also have access to this presentation. You'll be able to click on these links and look up some of the books I've mentioned here as well. Thank you very much for joining. Have a great day.